Hi everyone, welcome to the February 19th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragon. I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to change things up a little bit, get back to doing a Pick 5 sequence where we walk you through all of the races in a sequence at one card, one day, and we've chosen Aqueduct's Saturday card for this week's show. It's a pretty interesting set of races. It's not one of these sequences that's so impossible with a bunch of 12 and 14 horse fields. You don't typically get that in the winter at Aqueduct, but there's a pretty intriguing stakes race, the Maddie May for New York bred 3-year-old fillies, a 9-horse field, but one where you can make a case for a lot of horses. And the surrounding races, they're not the kind of races where you can really key on one horse. They're pretty competitive all the way through, so I think it'll be a fun one to discuss. There are some other things going on around the country this weekend. We chose to focus on Aqueduct. Obviously, there are some stakes races at Laurel. I know Craig can give some opinions about those on another podcast. There's the Saudi Cup, which is taking place early Saturday morning, at least here on the East Coast. We're not going to talk about that one from a wagering standpoint, but we will discuss it on the Pacecast next week with regard to the American horses that competed over there. So a lot of things going on around the country, Craig, but we're going to keep it at Aqueduct this week for the handicapping.
Yeah, it's always, I know it's your home base, and I'm a big Aqueduct guy. I mean, no matter what's going on and how big the cards are, I always have Aqueduct going as well. So, I mean, it's still even being the winter time, it's still some really top quality racing. And I think it's a really good place to bet. I know when your horses to watch this week, you did a segment which was very good, detailing a pretty strong bias last week. And I think there's been several of them. And I imagine a couple of them are going to come up today while we handicap it. And I think that makes it good for the bettor because it rewards those that do their homework.
Yeah, that's very true. And as we get into the handicapping today, there are going to be a couple of horses that I actually landed on because of the track bias situations. We're going to hop into Aqueduct in just a sec. Before we get to it, I just want to ask you, Craig, we're not going to handicap the Saudi Cup races or really promote wagering on them in any on this podcast. But I mean, just from the standpoint of the American horses that are competing there, did you have any thoughts about Nixco or Charlatan or even Channel Makers competing early on the card? I mean, it's always fun to see these top American horses in action, face some new customers. Any preference among those horses competing in the big race?
I haven't really looked at the card at all, but I will say I never prefer the Americans on turf in those races, so I assume I wouldn't like Channel Maker. I'm curious to see how Nixco is going to do. As a figure guy, he's got better figures than Charlatan, so I think he's going to be really tough to beat. It's a one-turn mile and an eighth over there, which probably plays to his advantage, so I'll just be watching as a fan. I assume if I even get up that early to see it, I'm not sure what time it goes off, but it's certainly one that'll have ramifications in the future as the horses start coming back here.
Yeah, for sure. They're two of the top older horses in the country right now, so I'll be interested to see how they perform. But obviously, you'd look forward to how they do when they come back to the United States and compete in some of the top races over here. Well, let's get into the handicapping. Aqueduct Saturday. This Pick 5 sequence begins with Race 5, and that is a maiden special weight event for the 3-year-olds, going a one-turn mile. And we've got some expensive purchases in here. We've got some second-time starters that look like they can improve, even a couple of first-time starters. I think the focus is probably towards the outside, as you've got a couple of second-time starters who both figure to take money. One of those was the $1 million yearling purchase, Willie Sutton, who debuted here just 12 days ago and was somewhat highly touted before that race. Didn't really show what he could do on the racetrack, was just a little dull in his performance, but now he's making his second start and stretching out, so I guess he might be able to do better.
Yeah, this is a pretty wide open race. I'm glad it's the first leg of the Pick 5 because, as you mentioned, there are a couple first-time starters in there, and I always like to see how they get played and if there's a horse that's really live on the board. But as you mentioned, in these spots, I generally gravitate towards second-time starters. And we have 3 of them in here, so that makes it a little bit tough. And what makes it even tougher is that those 3 are all trained by guys who don't particularly fire big shots first time out, but do better second time out. And we're talking Willie Sutton, as you mentioned, Lemon Drop Road for Jimmy Jerkins, who really is pronounced or markedly better second time out. And even Exalted Dream for Kelly Breen, who's part of an entry, that silly entry rule that I know they're trying to change in New York, but it is a bit frustrating as a bettor because of the married couple riding both halves. So it's one I imagine I'm going to have to spread. I will see what the action looks like on those first-time starters, Good Culture and I Am the Law. Good Culture is actually the top TimeformUS power pick. So I'll be curious to see if he takes any action. So I'll definitely be spreading around. If I had to make a top pick, it would be Willie Sutton. I think the day he ran last time out, when he did take that money, as you said, was just a really strong rail bias. A lot of horses went wire to wire. Others were struggling on the outside. So of the ones I expect to improve second out, I guess he would be the one that I expect to improve the most.
Yeah, I think all of the second-time starters have a right to improve in this race, as you mentioned. Who trains them and their typical patterns with these horses, I think they all figured a step forward. It's just who's going to step forward the most is the question I think you have to answer. I mean, Willie Sutton, it's hard to know what to do with him because he took money last time out, and he didn't run so well that makes you want to take him back if he's a short price again. I'm not really sure how the public's going to approach him this time. But what you said about that February 8th card, it is true. My take on it was that the rail bias got much stronger late in the day. I think we saw many more exaggerated rail running performances at the end of the card than the beginning of the card. And Willie Sutton ran in the first race of the day when I was a little on the fence about whether the rail was so strong at the beginning of the day. I know some people are a little reticent to take the leap to say that the track changed so much from a bias standpoint midway through a card. I thought it might have on that card, so we'll see how compromised he really was as he comes back for this second start, but he certainly has a right to improve. I'm hardly against him here. I'd use him for pick 5 purposes. I do prefer the horse to his outside, though, the number 7 Lemon Drop Road. I thought he's coming out of a slightly tougher race. That was a faster race. The winner, Crowded Trade. He's a Chad Brown first-time starter who looked pretty good in victory, and Lemon Drop Road just looked very green to me in that race. He broke with the field on the backstretch, but then seemed to be slow into stride. Pablo Morales was really riding him hard down the backstretch to keep in touch with the field, and he was just kind of greenly dropping back, seemed to be reacting badly to the kickback as they moved into the far turn. But once he got him to the outside in the stretch, he was finishing on at the end. Not a strong late run, but he was passing tired runners, staying on. Gave me the kind of impression that a mile around one turn is not going to be a major problem for him. And Jimmy Jerkins has good numbers with this move. I looked it up in DRF Formulator. Over the past 5 years, with horses stretching out from sprints to routes on dirt in their second starts as maidens, he's 5 for 23, 22% with a $5.34 ROI. So this is just a good move for Jimmy Jerkins, and I think this horse is likely to improve. But I'd also include in the conversation that Kelly Breen second-time starter, Exalted Charm. As you said, he's part of an entry, but I don't think his price is going to be too negatively affected because the other half of this entry, ridden by Katie Davis, that horse would have been probably 30 to 50 to 1 on its own. So it's not like his price is going to be bogged down too much by that horse. And I really don't know what to do with him because he did no running in his debut down at Gulfstream, but he was facing a much tougher field. Prevalence, the winner of that race, is one that I know some people are excited to see on the Kentucky Derby trail later this year. So I guess he has a chance to do better, but he's going to have to show that he can run.
Yeah, for me, he's the real wild card because he, as you said, he didn't really do any running. There hasn't been much run backs out of that race to really say how strong it was. Prevalence certainly looked strong, ran a nice figure that day, but tough to say. So, like I said, I'm just glad this race is first on the card. I have no problem with it. As I said, I'll be leaning on the second-time starters. And you make some good points about Lemon Drop Road. I know Jimmy Jerkins' second time out has been one of my favorite angles for a very long time. So it's not without data to back it up. It's just a spot where he really excels.
And just a couple notes on the first before I move on. The number 3, Good Culture, who you mentioned, Craig, as being one of our TimeformUS power picks. George Weaver does just fine with debut runners in general on the dirt. Actually has a great ROI. Not quite as well with horses debuting in routes. But I do want to note, 4 of this horse's recent workouts, actually all of the workouts from January 8th to February 4th, they match up perfectly with another horse, King Moon Racer, that debuted for George Weaver last week. And that horse took money and lost by 20 lengths. It got a 29 buyer. So I would just be a little hesitant to bet this horse. He was working with that one based on how that one ran. And I Am the Law, who goes out for John Terranova. Don't know too much about this horse. Liked his sales work. Just kind of funny to look at his pedigree because his second dam is that popular New Mexico bred from the early 2000s, Pepper's Pride, who I think never lost in 19 starts. So just a funny name to see as you look up the pedigree on that horse.
Yeah, I Am the Law, named for a big hit from Anthrax for our big metal thrashing fans out there. I'm not one of them, but I do know that song from a friend of mine. I remember it very well because I had a roommate who used to play it very loud all the time for a few years. So as a matter of fact, I may have to bet against that horse just because of that.
That's the kind of information you'll get, well, at least from Craig on the TimeformUS Forecast. It's certainly not something that I do. Let's move on to the second leg of this pick 5 sequence. It is the 6th race, claiming 32,000, going a mile, same distance as the 5th race, around that one-turn configuration at Aqueduct. And before we start, I will say that having already looked at the Sunday races at Aqueduct, we are probably going to have a scratch here of the number 1A It's All Relevant because he's entered back on Sunday. So I would imagine that the only half of the Rudy Rodriguez entry to participate here will be Supreme Aura, who did look like the stronger half anyway. So we'll see how that affects the outcome of this race, but it's likely to affect the pace a little bit because It's All Relevant was a speed in here, whereas Supreme Aura comes from a little bit off the pace. So perhaps that helps some other horses that were looking to attain forward position in this race. This one, though, it's one of those difficult winter Aqueduct allowance races, or claiming races, where you have horses coming from different class levels, some moving up in class, some dropping down in negative form. It's just difficult to know who to really trust.
Yeah, it is. There's also a couple Linda Rice horses, so it's hard to say if she's actually going to run them both in here. I guess we'll see if that happens. And I think both of her horses are interesting for different reasons, but very contentious race. I think it could go a lot of ways in here. And because of that, I went for a price horse. That's the 2-horse runabout. He's the first time for Amira Chichakli, I think is how you say it. I saw an interview when she took over for Gary Contessa back on TVG, but I can't remember how they pronounced it. But she's a trainer who didn't do much winning at all last year. She only won, I think, 4 out of 100 and some starts that she had. But she's kind of turned things around this year. I've tweeted about her a couple times. She's won 3 of 17, which isn't eye-popping, but when you only won 4 races the entirety of last year and over 100 starts, I think it's kind of noteworthy. And it seems like she's figuring things out, and I like Runabout. I think he fits in this race anyway. He draws inside. We'll have to see if the track is still playing like it was last week. That's always kind of a crapshoot. And luckily, we'll get a chance to watch some early races. Also, watch the racing on Friday, assuming they're still running. I think they are here as we talk about this. And this horse just intrigues me. He closed into a slow pace last time. Still got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. So I think he fits well and is going to be a nice price. A couple others in here that you mentioned. I mentioned the Linda Rice horses. We have Laddie Liam, who was actually a 2-year-old stakes winner at Laurel, but he's been off for a very long time. He's been gelded since then, but Linda Rice does just fine off of layoffs. There's no problem with that stat for her, but this one is pretty lengthy. And the other one that interests me a little bit from her is Tale of Silence, who is obviously has run much classier races before. He won the Grade 3 Westchester a few years back. He ran second in the Bull Roller to Maximum Security, but he was away a long time as well, changed over to Linda Rice's barn. Really didn't do a lot of running in what was obviously a much tougher race, but anytime Linda Rice spots a horse in a race like this, I take note, and I think that one has a big shot as well.
This is a kind of a funny race, as you mentioned Linda Rice, because as you go through it, I think every horse in this race, except for 2 of them, has either been trained or is now trained by Linda Rice, either in the past or currently. So just a race where Linda Rice has her hands all over it, all the horses in this race. I just kind of found that fascinating as I was going through this field. I have no problem with the horse that you mentioned as your likely top pick, the number 2 runabout. I think he's going to be a price for this barn that, as you said, is a little under the radar. And while Amira Shashakli has only claimed 2 horses since she took over the training for Gary Contessa, the most recent of those claims actually won for her. That was a horse named Limonite, who I believe she got from Mike Maker, ran back. And while that horse did benefit from a rail bias, he ran a pretty fast speed figure, winning a high-level optional claiming race a couple weeks ago. So she showed that she can win off the claim, at least with that horse. And just for anybody who's wondering, Runabout was claimed for the same owners as that horse. So just interesting as a horse that might fly under the radar in this race. I didn't pick him on top, but I think he's a horse that I could throw into a pick 5 sequence, maybe to add, inject some value and maybe go a little thinner with those tickets later. I am not against Supreme Aura per se, who I think will still be the favorite in this race. I pegged the entrant 8-5 on the morning line, assuming that both were going to go. I think Supreme Aura might be a slight favorite, even though he's moving up in class, but he just has so much back class, and he at least got back to a reasonable level of performance last time, albeit for that $16,000 claiming tag. But that was a race that featured a lot of drop downs, and he ran a nice 102 TimeformUS speed figure that day, so it looks like he's heading back in the right direction. And now he's first off the claim for Rudy Rodriguez, who has excellent numbers first off the claim, especially in dirt routes. So I think Supreme Aura is dangerous, just as the favorite in a race where I think you can make a case for a lot of horses. I didn't want to land on him for my top pick, but I'm definitely using him for pick 5 purposes. As for those 2 Linda Rice horses that you mentioned, at least those that are currently trained by Linda Rice, I mean, they're both somewhat interesting. I'm not going to try to resurrect Tale of Silence. His last race was too bad for me to get on board with, and now he's taking this significant drop in class. I'm a little skeptical of him. And Laddie Liam has similar questions coming off that layoff. It's actually kind of funny to look back to end of 2019. His current connections actually bought him at the Keeneland November sale after his last race, or I should say the Keeneland December sale, I'm sorry, after his last race for $450,000. Just kind of crazy to pay that much money for a 2-year-old that had won a Maryland bred stakes race. But when these horses turn 3, everyone's looking for their next Derby horse, so maybe he fell into that category. I don't know, but not a good sign that they paid $450,000 and now he's running back for $32,000 over a year later. I landed on the number 7 Heirloom Kitten here. This is a horse who was, until recently, in Linda Rice's barn, and he had just been in a little over his head, facing non-winners of One Allowance Company. He had run competitively at first against that level of competition, but was facing tougher fields like Forza Dioro and Hourglass Buck, winning his last 2 races at that level. They're just in another league than this horse, and he dropped down to a 25,000 condition claiming race last time, and I thought he ran fine. Got a respectable speed figure, stalked the pace, came through and won over 12th Labor, who came back to win again at a similar level with a reasonable speed figure. So I feel like Heirloom Kitten's in good form, and he's going first off the claim for David Duggan, who kind of like the horse that you mentioned, Craig, Runabout. David Duggan's a trainer that kind of fly under the radar at times, but he certainly does well. He's got a positive ROI off the claim over the past 5 years, so I expect him to do just fine with this horse, and I think he makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of directions you could go. I got no problem with Heirloom Kitten. I actually had a couple notes on him too, but you basically covered it. We didn't even mention the second choice on the morning line, Super Dude, who comes out of a nice win, albeit I think with a really easy trip where he got an easy lead and a slow pace. But I mean, he wouldn't shock me if he were to win this race. He does turn back to a 1-turn mile, but he's done fine at that before. So a lot of ways you can go, but that's why I was kind of looking for a price.
Yeah, an interesting stat that I found for Super Dude, who I agree with you. Of the short prices, I'm a little bit against him. I thought he got a perfect trip last time. But also, Jeremiah Engelhardt is a trainer who, at different times during his career, has had hot and cold streaks, and he's just coming off a bit of a cold spell in 2020. And furthermore, he's a guy who at one time was a pretty prolific and successful claiming trainer. And I was looking up his stats in DRF Formulator, and he has not won with a horse first off the claim since 2018. I just thought that was so surprising for somebody who I pegged as a trainer who's relatively successful off the claim, or at least was going back a few seasons. So I was just a little wary of him at what could be a short price in this race.
Yeah, I was surprised. I didn't look it up in Formulator, but I just relied on our TimeformUS ratings. And like you, I remember him being a guy who was really handy off the claim. I can remember him being rated at least in the 80s, maybe even hitting the 90 mark first off the claim, and he's now a 55, which is pretty low first time off the claim in our rating. So it just backs up what you saw in Formulator, and it took me by surprise as well.
Moving on to the 7th race on Saturday at Aqueduct. This one is a New York bred nominators of one allowance race going 6 furlongs. And we've got a couple of horses towards the outside that faced off last time at this same level and finished just a neck apart, those being Whale and Josie and Eloquent Speaker. Eloquent Speaker is probably going to be the shorter price once again in this race, as she was quite a bit shorter on the tote board last time, even though she finished behind Whale and Josie, because it seems like she might have an advantage this time with the pace of this race, as there doesn't appear to be that much speed signed on, and depending on how they ride her, she certainly has more tactical speed than that main rival.
Yeah, I'm a little curious what to do with her. I think you have to use her just because of the pace situation. I did watch the replay. I wasn't blown away. I expected that when I watched the replay that I was going to see this super cautious ride where she just was taken back for no apparent reason. But I think she was a little bit sluggish to get going. I mean, she broke okay, but it just took her a little while to get in stride. And that caused her some problems where she basically got hung wide around the entire turn. Still made what looked like a winning move, but just flattened out late and got run down by a horse that was moving up the inside. So while I certainly think she can win here, I don't love her in this spot. She definitely needs a more aggressive ride, in my opinion, where she really gets hustled, because that didn't happen. I don't want to give the impression that it was some aggressive ride and she just didn't respond. I think she just didn't get her feet under her all that quick, and the rider didn't, just kind of went with the flow there. So I actually like another horse in here at a bit of a price that's also going to be more forward, I think, than what's even shown in the pace projector, and that's the 5-horse Flush. You have her pegged at 10-1 on the morning line, but she comes in with one of my all-time favorite angle. She's third off the layoff, but she didn't do much running first time out at all. But second time out, she really showed high speed. She showed speed that she hadn't shown in a long time. She really improved her TimeformUS speed figure up to 90, and she's a horse that, while we have her shown in fourth, it wouldn't surprise me if she is on the lead or even second. And I'm expecting some more improvement for Bill Mott, and I just think she's a real overlay at this price.
Yeah, it's a race that gets tricky when you get past the two favorites, because you could make a case for a lot of kind of fuzzy horses, and I'd put Flush in that same category, ones that have to take a step forward, but do have some things to like about them. I mean, as for those two horses drawn towards the outside that I think are going to take the most money, I mean, Eloquent Speaker, I totally agree with what you said about her last race, Craig. It's not that it was Eric Consel's fault. It almost looked like he was riding to instructions, as he was not raiding her to the point where she wanted to run off on him and he was trying to get her off the pace. She just looked a little bit dull in the early going, and that does fit with the equipment change that they made, because they took the blinkers off for the last race. So maybe they wanted to get her off the pace and be a little bit less aggressive, because she had been showing a lot of speed and fading at the end of her races. So maybe they were just trying to attempt a different tactic to get her to the winner's circle. It almost worked out, because she got there and just flattened out at the end of the race. She is making her first start for the new barn, Tony Dutrow. I think it's a pretty lateral move, Jeremiah Englehart to Tony Dutrow. They both do a good job, so I'm not really concerned about that. Though I do agree also with what you said about the pace projector for this race. I think there are a couple of horses to the inside of Eloquent Speaker, even though she's shown on a clear lead. There are some others that might be able to be more forwardly placed in this race. Flush is definitely one of them. She's always the kind of horse that the pace projector is not going to capture perfectly, because she's coming off a couple races prior to her last where she didn't show the speed that she's capable of showing. And she did last time. If she had 3 races like her last race in her PPs, she'd probably be shown right up there with Eloquent Speaker in the pace projector. I'm a little bit iffy. I'm wishy-washy on Flush. I don't really know what to do with her, because I never thought she was that good, even when she was in Kieran McLaughlin's barn. She just wasn't my kind of horse. And now she's with Bill Mott, and she might be slowly rounding into form. I just wonder, even if she gets back to good form, if she's good enough to win this race. So she wasn't for me, but I hear where you're going with her, Craig. Personally, I don't see why you're supposed to be so against Whale and Josie, who finished ahead of Eloquent Speaker last time. And I know she's 2 for 24 in her career, and she's had a bunch of chances at this level and hasn't broken through, but it feels like she's in the best form of her career right now. I mean, she was right there two back in the same race at this level. And then last time, she didn't break well. She made a middle move that was even more pronounced than that of Eloquent Speaker, got there at the late stages of the race and was just kind of run down by Impossible Donna, who was resurgent on the inside. But at least she was battling back at the end, whereas Eloquent Speaker just kind of gave it up. So I know she might be a little tough to take given her career record, but I think she makes a lot of sense here. My one reservation with her, and the reason that I'm not all in on her, is that she does have a tendency to break slowly more often than not, and that could be detrimental if the pace doesn't develop in this race. But once you get past those two, I find it difficult to really latch on to anybody else. I mean, a big wild card in this race is the number 3 More Glitter for Todd Pletcher. She's returning from a layoff of 14 months, having not raced since December 2019 when she was a 2-year-old. I mean, I didn't think she was much horse back then. She could be a different runner now that she's had so much time to mature, and Todd Pletcher is the best in the business off layoffs like this. I just didn't know what to do with her, and she could take money.
Yeah, I was a little leery of her. I mean, I wouldn't argue with somebody that wanted to use her defensively, but I'm always a little leery of horses. She broke her maiden in an off-the-turf spot. I have to assume that was a pretty weak field. She then came back in a stakes that was off the turf. I'm not sure what we even have with this horse. And if she's a short price, she's one I'm not interested in. As for Waylon Josie, I kind of cut mine short, but I'm not against her at all. I actually prefer her a little bit to Eloquent Speaker. And you made a good point about the blinkers, because it almost looks like that's what happened, and they're not going back on. So it makes me even a little more, have a little more trepidation about thinking she's going to be on some lone easy lead, because I just didn't see it at the break last time. She looked like a horse who might very well have adopted that style without the blinkers.
Yeah, it's a difficult race for pick 5 purposes, because you could either go really deep or try to narrow it down. I'd probably try to narrow it down and get through it mostly with Waylon Josie and Eloquent Speaker, but it's certainly a treacherous race. Moving on to the feature race on this Aqueduct card, the 8th race. That is the Maddie May going the 1-turn mile distance for the New York bred 3-year-old fillies. And I found this to be a really interesting stakes event. Even if before we decided to do this Aqueduct pick 5 sequence, this is a race that I want to talk about in this podcast, because I think there are many ways to go. A lot of horses of similar talent, many stretching out in distance, so you kind of have to factor stamina in a little bit. A horse that I think could be favored here that you probably have to have an opinion about is the number 8 Brattle House, a $775,000 yearling purchase, who was highly regarded before she made her debut last November, ran to that hype, winning off impressively, didn't get the fastest speed figure, but she certainly looked good doing it. She's just one of these big, imposing fillies who physically and in terms of ability towered over her competition that day, but the waters are getting a lot deeper for her here.
Yeah, I don't love her in this spot. Her speed figure was just okay. It was an 88. She obviously won really easily that day. But when you look back through the chart, I mean, it was not much of a field. Nobody in that field has really done any running coming back. The race was back in November, so we've had lots of run backs. Several of the horses have run back multiple times. So I'll just start by saying I don't particularly care for her at all. I'm going to throw it back to you here, because I have a sneaky suspicion we're going to land on the same horse. And I'm just curious how you see it, and if in fact I'm going to be right.
So I think as we get to the horse that I picked, I first want to talk about the pace of this race, because Brattle House is shown on the early lead, and she did go to the front in her debut, but I feel like she's going to have to run faster to make the lead here, because we've got a few stretch-out sprinters who I think have to be ridden forwardly, including the number 6 Irish Constitution, who's been contesting the pace in sprint races, as has the number 7 Secret Love. I think they'll be forwardly placed, and even horses towards the inside, like the number 2 Frost Me, they don't want to be far off the pace, so I think they could be moving at an honest clip up front. I don't think it's the kind of race that's going to completely fall apart, but I'm not viewing Brattle House as a horse that's going to get loose on the front end again. I think she's going to face a more competitive pace scenario than that. So I'm hoping that's the case, because I like a closer in this race, and the one that interests me, and I think she's got to be a square price in here, is the number 5 Shane's Pretty Lady. You might remember, if you watch my Horses to Watch segments often, that I did highlight this horse on a recent episode based on her her last trip from January 31st. January 31st was a card at Aqueduct that featured a pronounced dead rail. Really, if you were in the first couple of paths closest to the inside, you just didn't have any success on that card. You had horses that were winning races or really even finishing in the money in races were 3, 4, 5 paths off the rail, really for almost every race of the day. And Make Mischief, who won that race, is also in here. Just watch the trip that she got in that race. She was about 5 wide all the way around the racetrack, and that turned out to be the best path, and she ran away from that field at the end. Shane's Pretty Lady, on the other hand, she was inside early, and once they got into the stretch, it's like the Red Seas parted, and everybody went off the rail, except for Eric Gonzell, who drove her right down to the inside. And this race was halfway through the card, so I'm not going to blame Eric for not being aware of the bias by that point. But you could see she had run at the quarter pole, but as soon as she went down to that going down on the rail, she lost all her momentum and was just spinning her wheels down there. I think she would have finished much closer if not for that bias. And you saw that in her prior race when she finished a pretty good second to Frost Me, closing into a moderate pace. I think she's going to get more pace to close into this time. She handles the mile. And to me, she looks like the right price horse to take in this race.
Yeah, I nailed it. It only paid $360. I knew we were going to like because of course I do watch your horses to watch segment, and I saw the exact same thing you did. I mean, she was on the rail basically every single step of the way, and she was one of the very few horses that you would see who was still trying to run on through the lane and actually held pretty well, all things considered. So I don't have a whole lot more to add to that. I mean, I guess if I'm playing a pick 5, I would have a hard time using the winner Make Mischief, even though she comes in with the top TimeformUS speed figure, just because, as you mentioned, I mean, she literally had every single thing go her way. This is a day where I wish I could consult with things like Rags and Thoroughgraph to see how they rate days like this, where there's just a ton of ground loss, because it's certainly a day where I wouldn't want to give extra credit for horses being wide. And maybe they do that. I'm not familiar enough with them to know if they adjust in situations like that. But a couple other horses I do think you might want to use are Frost Me, who you mentioned, to beat Shane's Pretty Lady. Pretty fair and square, though, you know, that one was up much closer that day to a pretty tepid pace. But, I mean, I think she's a decent enough filly. She gets a good post position again, and if the inside's okay, she'll be dangerous. And the same thing goes for the horse insider, Vacay for Todd Pletcher. She's solid enough as well, but Shane's Pretty Lady is the one I'm going to be leaning on in here.
Yeah, we view this race very similarly. Shane's Pretty Lady is my top pick, and I would use Frost Me, who, as you said, beat her last time. She'll be a shorter price, but I think she's also a good tender in this race, and I'm not so against Make Mischief. I'm a little concerned about the stretch out to a mile, but she ran the race that she ran last time. She was not hindered by the track, but it's not like she didn't have good races as from her 2-year-old season that would back up that form. That race didn't come out of nowhere, so I'm not so against her here. I'd use her defensively, and be a little bit more against the short prices like Vacay and Brattle House. They can win this race for sure, but I didn't see them as having any clear edge in here where they should be shorter prices than the ones that we just mentioned. We'll finish things up with the final race of this Pick 5 sequence and the final race at Aqueduct on Saturday. That's the 9th race. 6 furlongs, maiden 20,000 claiming race, and another pretty competitive field because the horse to beat, and I think clearly the horse to beat, is the number 5 Warfront Fighter, who's coming off a couple of second place finishes at this level. And if he repeats either of those races, he's going to be right there at the end. The problem is this horse has now had 12 chances. And while he might be in career form, typically in these kinds of races, you want horses that have a little more upside than this one.
Yeah, I think we have similar thinking here. I mean, this is the kind of race vertically that I'm going to attack at the end of the card, regardless of where I stand if I play a pick 5. Because the top 2 morning line choices in here are combined 0 for 25. Warfront Fighter, as you mentioned, and Scorpion Dynasty, the 2 horse. Now, of those 2, I much prefer Warfront Fighter, as he is one who I think has a little more heart, and maybe he's finally just finding his right level. Although he's been at this level a few times, at least he's usually running well at it. Whereas the 2 horse Scorpion Dynasty is a horse who's just blown many open leads. He's got the best TimeformUS speed figures, but I think that's he's a bad horse for our system where he gets rewarded for going fast early because he basically won't rate. He gives it up in the lane. And at 3-1 on the morning line, I want absolutely no parts of Scorpion Dynasty. He's the kind of horse I wouldn't even bet on a speed bias track most of the time because he usually will just find a way to lose. So because of that, the horse I actually landed on top, I'm going to go back to that same January 31st card, and that's Ouch, 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 the 3 horse. He was a horse who on that day spent every single step of the journey on the rail. Now, he didn't do much running at all, unlike the horse we mentioned in the last race, Shane's Pretty Lady. But the starts before that, he's been okay. And I just think he's a horse who's sitting on a big race. His form's really dirtied up. And I think because of it, we're going to get a much fairer price than we will on the other 2 in here.
Yeah, you covered Ouch, Ouch, Ouch quite well. I mean, if I like Shane's Pretty Lady in the last race, I've got to give this horse a shot because, as you said, even though he did no running, and I think the fact that he did no running over that track and regressed so significantly racing on the dead rail, I think that just shows how well Shane's Pretty Lady ran in that last race because we just didn't see horses running well on the rail on that January 31st card. So I'm willing to give Ouch, Ouch, Ouch that as an excuse, and he did run reasonably well in his prior race. He's going to have to improve overall in his third career start to take down a horse like Warfront Fighter, but he does have more upside than many in this race, so I'll certainly use him. And I'd also use the number 6 Kith, who he was off the rail in that same January 31st race, but he was running at a tougher maiden claiming $40,000 level against real horses, and he only lost by 7 lengths and finished 4th. And that wasn't the only time that he's run well in the dirt. He also has a good effort against slightly cheaper from October last year, so I think he's just as viable as Ouch, 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 probably not going to be as big of a price, but I think both of these horses are the right alternatives if you're looking for somebody beyond Warfront Fighter.
Yeah, I've got no problem with Kith, and I might even throw in Confectioner as like a C-type horse, just because I think he's ran okay. I like the post position here, and I just really don't like the top 2. I shouldn't say, I mean, Warfront Fighter won't surprise me. Scorpion Dynasty, I just don't like it all. So this is the kind of race I will definitely be in, as I mentioned, vertically, and hope to get some more than one price into the trifecta or even superfecta.
Yeah, I would say this is not an easy pick 5 sequence, even though we don't have any really large fields throughout it. I didn't find too many races where I could narrow it down to just one horse. At the very least, I think I would try to get through a race like that 7th with Whale and Josie, an Eloquent Speaker, maybe with 2 horses. But it's I thought it was one sequence that's not going to be easy. I would imagine this sequence is going to, it's whoever hits it is going to get a nice payout because I don't see it being dominated by favorites.
No, the way I'm going to play it, if I do, of course, we got to see scratches and things like that and how the track's playing. But I'm going to try to lean on some of the horses that are going to be prices in the races I go short. Shane's Pretty Lady, and I think it was Flush is the name of the other one. I'm so bad with names these days.
Yeah, Flush is that horse.
Yeah, you'll understand when you get to be 53. But yeah, that's the way I'm going to play. And then spread in the races where I don't particularly love the favorites and think they're vulnerable. And, you know, this is one where if you're right on your price horses a couple of times, you can really cash big.
That is definitely true. So we'll have to check in. We do the TimeformUS Pacecast next week to see how we did, and we'll talk about any of these races, obviously, if they're notable from a speed figure standpoint as well. And when we record that Pacecast on Tuesday, that's when we'll do some recaps of other stakes races happening around the country, like that card at Laurel where they're running the General George and the Barbara Fitchie. And of course, the races in Saudi Arabia this weekend. We'll talk about how the American horses fared overseas. Well, that's all for the TimeformUS Forecast this week. Remember, you can always catch us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and make sure to stay tuned for that upcoming podcast on Tuesday.